$340,000. 11 days. 4 specialists flown in from 2 different states. And the Lamborghini Urus sitting in Bay 1 of Ashford Motor Group's private service facility still wouldn't move under its own power. Celeste Ashford had built her logistics empire before she turned 34. She had negotiated freight contracts with people who made her nervous and won. She had restructured a failing warehouse operation in 18 months and turned it profitable. She had done things that people with twice her experience said couldn't be done, and she had done them without asking for permission or applause. But she could not fix her car. The Urus had been her one indulgence. Not the company fleet of Escalades, not the efficiency of the Audi she drove to board meetings. This one she'd bought because she'd seen it on a test track in Scottsdale, and something in her chest had said yes before her brain had finished the sentence. Volcanic black exterior, cream interior, the kind of machine that made you understand what engineers dreamed about when they had no constraints. She'd written the check the same afternoon. Now it sat in Bay 1 with its hood open and its electrical system in open revolt, and nobody could tell her why. Drop a comment right now with your city. Let's see how far this story reaches. And stay until the end. Because the moment that changes everything in this one, you will not see coming. The car had started misfiring on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the Ashford Group's annual investor presentation. By Thursday, it had stopped starting altogether. By the following Monday, Celeste had authorized the first specialist. By Friday of that week, she'd authorized 2 more. The invoices had come in organized and professional and collectively breathtaking, and the car had not moved. The current lead diagnostician was a man named Victor Presley, who had credentials that read like a European automotive almanac and a manner that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. He had been on site for 4 days. He charged accordingly. Celeste was at her standing desk on the 3rd floor when her operations manager, a composed and generally unflappable woman named Diane, no, not Diane, someone else entirely. Her operations manager, Patricia, came in without knocking, which told Celeste everything about the nature of the news before a word was spoken. Presley's team wants another authorization, Patricia said, stopping just inside the doorway. Celeste set down her pen. For what? Full ECU replacement. Primary and secondary. They're saying the diagnostic points to a firmware cascade issue that may have corrupted both units simultaneously. How much? Patricia exhaled. $92,000. It would bring the total to $341. Celeste looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Get Presley up here." He arrived 14 minutes later, which was 11 minutes longer than the walk from the service bay to the 3rd floor should have taken. Celeste clocked every one of those minutes because she was a person who noticed things like that, had always noticed things like that, and had learned over the years that the gap between when someone could arrive and when they chose to arrive told you something important about how they understood the relationship. Presley was 60, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples in the distinguished way that certain men of his profession seemed to cultivate deliberately. His credentials were real. She'd verified them before she'd hired him. He had worked with 3 different hypercar manufacturers, consulted for 2 racing programs, and his name appeared in trade publications with the kind of regularity that either meant you were genuinely exceptional or genuinely good at self-promotion. In Presley's case, she suspected some portion of both. He sat without being invited. "Walk me through the ECU recommendation," Celeste said. He did. For 12 minutes, he walked her through it. The technical language, precise and layered, the logic internally consistent enough that she couldn't find a clean thread to pull. She had a mechanical background, not deep, but enough to follow the architecture of what he was saying without being able to challenge the specifics. She suspected he was counting on exactly that. When he finished, she was quiet. "Victor," she said, "I'm going to ask you a straight question, and I need a straight answer." He inclined his head slightly. "Do you actually know what's wrong with my car?" The pause that followed was approximately 2 seconds long, which was 1.5 seconds longer than a certain man would have needed. "We have strong indicators," he said carefully, "that the issue is firmware related, and the ECU replacement address is the most probable. It's not a straight answer." He looked at her. "It's the honest one. She authorized the replacement. She told him she wanted it done by end of day tomorrow. She told him she wanted a guarantee. He told her he couldn't guarantee outcomes at this diagnostic level. She told him they had a different kind of problem then, and asked Patricia to see him out. She went down to the service bay herself that evening, after the building had mostly emptied. She didn't make a habit of it. Being on the floor wasn't her job anymore, hadn't been in years. But it was nearly 8 o'clock on a Wednesday, and the city outside. Bozeman in October, cold coming off the mountains in thin early waves, was doing what it did when the season turned, and she found herself standing next to the Urus with her hands in the pockets of her blazer, doing nothing in particular, except looking at a car she loved and could not fix. She ran one hand along the driver's side door. The paint was cool and perfect under her fingers. She had never been sentimental about possessions. She'd grown up without money in the specific way that meant you learned not to get attached to things because things left or broke or got taken. In the apartment she'd grown up in Billings, with her mother working 2 jobs and the heat that was always one late bill away from going out, sentimentality had been a luxury they couldn't afford. She had bought this car with the specific, slightly embarrassing awareness that she was buying it for no strategic reason whatsoever. That she wanted it because she wanted it, which was a sentence that had taken her 34 years to be comfortable saying. And now it sat in Bay 1, dead. She heard footsteps on the epoxy floor behind her and turned. It was a young technician she recognized from the day's staff. 23, 24, quiet, had been with the company for about 14 months. His name was Owen, and he was still in his work shirt, which meant he'd stayed late. "Sorry," he said, pulling up short when he saw her. "I left my phone. I didn't realize anyone was still. You're fine." She turned back to the car. "You've been working this job some. Presley's team has been running the main diagnostic. We've mostly been doing setup and tear down. What do you think is wrong with it?" He blinked. It wasn't the question a junior tech expected from the owner of the company. "I mean me? You've had 11 days in proximity to this car. What's your read?" Owen was quiet for a moment, turning something over visibly. She could see him calculating the professional risk of having an opinion that contradicted a 60-year-old specialist with a wall of certifications. "I think," he said slowly, "that whatever it is, it's small, physically small, because every time Presley's team runs the major diagnostics, everything comes back within normal range. The car isn't catastrophically broken. Something is just stopping a specific sequence from completing." He paused. "It reminds me of an issue I saw during my second year in school. Someone brought in a Range Rover that kept cutting out at highway speeds. Took 3 weeks. Turned out to be a microfracture in a grounding strap connection. Barely visible to the naked eye." Celeste looked at him. "You mentioned this to Presley." Owen's expression gave her the answer before he did. He said the system's architecture on a Lamborghini Urus is not analogous to a consumer SUV. "He's not wrong about that." "No," Owen agreed. "He's not." She looked back at the car. "Go home. Get some sleep." "Yes, ma'am." He turned to go, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think the problem is somewhere the standard protocols aren't looking. Presley is good at finding the things that are supposed to be there. I think this one isn't supposed to be there." She didn't respond. After he left, she stood in the quiet of Bay 1 a while longer, alone with the Urus and the fluorescent hum, and no answers. The 12th morning arrived flat and gray, the way difficult stretches always arrived. Not with drama, just with the dull fact of themselves. She was at her desk by 7:15 when the call came from the front entrance. "Miss Ashford." It was the reception desk. "There's a situation at the service entrance." She set down her coffee. "What kind of situation?" "A truck pulled in. A pickup, older. The driver says he has a parts delivery for an Ashford Group location on Commerce, but the part number doesn't match anything in our system. He was about to leave when he walked past Bay 1 and saw the Urus through the open doors." A pause. He stopped. He asked Owen what was wrong with it. Owen told him it had been down for 11 days, and now the driver is saying he might know what the problem is. Celeste was already standing. "Don't let that truck move," she said. "I'll be down in 2 minutes." She heard him before she saw him. Presley's voice carried across the service floor with the particular resonance of a man who had spent decades being the authority in rooms and was currently experiencing the specific indignity of having that authority questioned by someone who had arrived in a pickup truck. She pushed through the stairwell door and took in the scene in approximately 3 seconds. Presley standing with his arms crossed and his face a controlled shade of red, talking at, not to, at, a man in a faded canvas work jacket who was holding a paper delivery manifest, and listening with the patience of someone who had been in this position before and was not particularly rattled by it. The man was maybe 40-42, medium height, lean in the way that came from actual physical work rather than intentional exercise. Dark hair with some gray starting at the temples. His jacket had a small embroidered patch on the left chest, too small to read from across the floor. And his work boots were the broken-in kind that suggested they'd been resoled at least once. He was not looking at Presley. He was looking at the Urus, specifically at the rear section, at the area around the battery housing, and the components visible near the left rear quarter. He was looking at the car the way someone looked at a problem they were already working through in their head. "I don't care what you think you observed," Presley was saying, "because I am telling you, we have run every documented and undocumented diagnostic protocol on that vehicle, and the suggestion that a secondary electrical issue could have been overlooked by my—" "I didn't say overlooked," the man said without looking away from the car. His voice was unhurried, a Montana accent, the kind with some flatness in it. "I said it might not appear in standard diagnostics. There's a reason for that. There is no diagnostic protocol that would miss a grounding issue in a 2022 Urus. In the 2022 standard build, you're right." The man paused. "This isn't a standard 2022. Presley stopped. The room went quiet the way rooms went quiet when something unexpected cut through noise. Celeste stepped forward. "Who are you?" The man finally looked away from the car. His eyes found her, dark brown, direct, the kind of eyes that moved to the relevant thing in a room quickly and stayed there. "Gideon Hale," he said. "I run a shop out in White Sulphur Springs. I had a parts delivery for an Ashford Group location on Commerce Avenue. I think the dispatch gave me the wrong address. This is the Bozeman Service Facility," Celeste said. "Yeah, I figured that out." A brief pause. "I'm sorry for the confusion. I can get out of your way." "Wait." She looked at Presley. Then back at the man. "You said not a standard 2022. What do you mean?" Presley made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same general territory. Celeste said, "Victor," quietly, without heat. And he stopped, in the way people stopped, when the temperature in a conversation shifted and they understood it was no longer going in a direction they controlled. She looked at Gideon. "Answer the question." He looked at the car for a moment, then back at her. "This Urus has the Performante electrical package," he said, which was a factory option on certain 2022 builds, specified individually at order. It includes a modified battery management system and a secondary grounding configuration that was added specifically to support the higher amperage draw of the upgraded audio and cooling systems. He paused. The secondary configuration isn't in the standard Lamborghini service documentation. It was added to individual vehicle records during the build process, but it's not in the general technical service manual that most diagnosticians are working from. The service floor was completely silent. "There's a secondary grounding terminal," he continued, "on the left rear frame rail, behind the battery management module. It's behind a cover panel that looks structural. You'd miss it if you didn't know it was there. In normal operating temperatures, the secondary doesn't matter much. The primary handles the load. But in cold conditions," he paused. "Bozeman in October. Morning temperatures dropping into the 20s. He looked at her steadily. "The metal contracts. If the secondary terminal has any corrosion or micro-fatigue in the contact surface, the contraction is enough to break continuity. The battery management system reads the startup sequence as initiated. The ECU registers the command. But the car doesn't start because the ground return isn't clean enough to complete the sequence." He stopped. Presley said, "That is an extraordinary claim." "I know," Gideon said without defensiveness. "And where exactly are you getting this information about a vehicle-specific electrical modification?" Gideon looked at Presley for a moment, with the expression of a man deciding how much of a conversation he wanted to have. "I was a senior electrical systems engineer at a Tier 1 automotive supplier for 9 years, he said. "My last contract was with the Lamborghini production line at Sant'Agata. I was on the team that designed and specified the Performante electrical package that went into those 2022 builds." A pause. "I know about the secondary grounding terminal because I wrote the specification for it." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Owen made a sound that was very close to a laugh, quickly suppressed. One of Presley's technicians looked at the floor. Presley himself drew up to his full height with the compressed energy of a man recalibrating in real time. "You were at Sant'Agata," he started, "for 14 months, specifically on the high-amperage electrical systems team. I wasn't building the whole car. There was a team of 8, but the Performante package grounding spec, that one I know." He folded the delivery manifest and tucked it into his jacket pocket, a small practical motion. Celeste said, "You left automotive engineering." "Yes, to run a repair shop in White Sulphur Springs." It wasn't quite a question. He heard it as what it was. "I left to raise my daughter," he said simply. "She was 4. Her mother died and I was the one who was here. The engineering work required being in Europe most of the year, which worked fine when it was just me. It stopped working the minute it wasn't just me." He said it plainly, the way people said things they had made peace with. White Sulphur Springs seemed like the right place to land. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. "You said the terminal is behind a cover panel on the left rear frame rail." "Left rear, yes. Looks like a structural fairing. Not obvious. Can you show me?" Presley said, "Miss Ashford, I have to strongly advise. Victor." She looked at him directly. "Your team has had 11 days and over $300,000, and the car does not start. I'm going to let this man look at it. If he's wrong, we'll know in 10 minutes. She left the rest unfinished, which was more pointed than completing it. Presley's jaw tightened. He stepped back. He did not say anything more. Celeste looked at Gideon. "What do you need?" He thought for a moment. "Flashlight, a multimeter, and an 8mm socket if you have one." Owen was already moving. He worked quietly. That was the first thing she noticed. Presley's team had been in this bay for 4 days, and the 4 days had a specific texture to them. Equipment hum, keyboard input, the low continuous murmur of technician-to-technician consultation, the organized performance of expertise made visible and audible. The remote specialist, who had joined by video from Dallas. The Lamborghini technical liaison, who had flown in from New Jersey and spent 6 hours working through every documented failure mode in the manufacturer records. They had all worked with varying degrees of sound. Gideon made almost none. He lay down on the service floor, not on a creeper, just on the floor, on his back, and ran the flashlight up under the rear section of the Urus while everyone watched. For about 30 seconds there was nothing but the movement of light and the sound of his slow, controlled breathing. Then, there it is. Owen crouched down beside him. "I see a panel." "Yep." 8mm and passed the socket down. 30 more seconds of careful, precise movement. A small composite cover panel came free. Gideon handed it sideways without looking, and Owen caught it. The multimeter came next. Gideon checked resistance across the secondary terminal. He read it twice, the way someone read something when they wanted to be sure of what they were seeing before they said it. He slid out from under the car, sat up, looked at the readout. "There you go," he said quietly. To no one in particular. He turned the multimeter towards Celeste so she could see the screen. She looked at the number. Even with her limited electrical knowledge, she understood enough to know it was wrong. Resistance far higher than continuity should produce. "Micro-corrosion on the terminal contact surface," he said. "Cold morning, metal contracts, contact breaks. Secondary ground fails. The startup sequence can't complete." He glanced toward Presley's team. "Your diagnostics almost certainly showed the primary ground at full continuity, which is why everything came back normal. The secondary isn't in the standard test protocol. If you didn't know it was there, you weren't going to find it." Nobody from Presley's team said anything. Gideon stood up, brushed the floor grit off his jacket, with the unself-conscious practicality of a man who had been lying on floors his entire working life. He held out his hand. "Can I get a small wire brush and contact cleaner? Whatever you have." 2 minutes. That was how long it took once he had the materials. He cleaned the terminal surface, rechecked continuity on the multimeter, the number was now correct, and reassembled the cover panel with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this kind of work 10,000 times before. He stood, looked at Celeste. "The repair is temporary," he said, before she could speak. "The terminal has surface degradation that cleaning will improve but not fix permanently. You need the factory replacement terminal assembly for the Performante package. I'd contact the Lamborghini Technical Center in Los Angeles. They may have it in stock. If not, it comes from Sant'Agata, which is probably 8 to 10 business days. Can the car be driven in the meantime? In warm temperatures, probably. I wouldn't take it out below 40 degrees. He paused. I wouldn't take it out at all until the replacement is in. She looked at Owen. Owen got into the driver's seat. The Lamborghini Urus started on the first press of the button. The sound it made was not like other cars. A deep, organized violence that moved through the floor and the walls and the bones of everyone standing in Bay 1, the kind of sound that made you understand on a physical level what the machine was for. It ran. 11 days, $340,000. 4 specialists. One man who'd driven to the wrong address. The room didn't erupt. Nobody applauded. People just stood there, looking at a running car. The sound of the engine against the silence of the people watching it was the loudest thing in the building. The conversation with Presley happened in the conference room, off the service floor. It was short and not pleasant, and Celeste kept her voice level throughout, which was harder than raising it would have been. She told him the final invoice would be reviewed, and she would be in touch through Patricia. She told him, near the end, that she understood his team had not had the information they would have needed to find the fault, and that she wasn't imputing incompetence. She told him the honest accounting was that he had done excellent work on the wrong version of the problem. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't know about the Performante spec, he said. No, you couldn't have, without knowing this particular car's build record. She paused. That's not an excuse. It's just accurate. After he left, she stood in the conference room alone and looked at the automotive prints on the wall. A Countach, a Diablo, a Huracan, and tried to locate the feeling underneath the day. What she found was not simple. There was relief, obviously. The car ran. But underneath the relief was something harder and less comfortable. The specific flat discomfort of having paid $340,000 in confidence and received very little certainty in return. Of having evaluated Presley's team by the weight of their credentials and their presentation and their professional carriage, and not having considered that the edge of this particular problem lay somewhere those credentials didn't reach. She had made the wrong call. She went back to the service floor. Gideon was at his truck, an older Ford F-250, dark gray, the bed modified with built-in tool storage, and a rear step she recognized as something he'd probably installed himself, loading his toolbox with the efficient movements of a man who had a schedule he'd already departed from. She crossed the floor. Mr. Hale. He turned. That same quality of attention, not guarded exactly, but self-contained. Present in the way that people were present when they weren't performing presence. Miss Ashford, you're leaving. I still have the commerce delivery to sort out. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. My daughter's going to ask why I'm late. How old is she? Something shifted in his face. Not much, but enough to see. 7, he said. 7 3/4. She'd remind me the 3/4 matters. Celeste looked at him for a moment. I'd like to offer you a consulting contract, she said. Temporary. For the repair completion when the factory terminal arrives. I want someone who understands this specific vehicle's electrical configuration to be in the room when the parts come in. He looked at her steadily. What are you offering? Name a rate. Something like amusement passed across his face, brief and quiet. I charge $190 an hour for specialized consultation. Done. The part will likely take 2 weeks. Call it 30 hours of work. I'll authorize 40 to give you room. He was quiet for a moment. I'll need to rearrange some things at the shop, he said. I have 2 people working for me and a full schedule. I'll compensate for the disruption. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, once the decisive kind. All right. He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm, and his palm was rough in the specific way of hands that had been doing real physical work for a long time. I'll have Patricia send the contract this afternoon, she said. That works. He turned back to the truck, then stopped with his hand on the door. The car, he said, not turning around. She waited. The reason it matters to you, it's not really about the car, is it? She was quiet. What makes you say that? She said finally. You were in that bay last night, he said. Past 8 o'clock, alone, not running diagnostics, not reviewing reports, just standing next to it. He glanced back over his shoulder. People who care about machines because of what they cost don't do that. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she had nothing to say to that. Drive safe, Mr. Hale, she said. He got in the truck. She stood at the service entrance and watched him pull out, the gray Ford navigating the service drive with the careful steadiness of a man who didn't rush. The sound of the truck faded. Behind her, in Bay 1, the Urus was still running. The factory parts took 9 days. Gideon had estimated 8 to 10 business days. The terminal assembly arrived on a Thursday morning in a matte black Lamborghini case with the Sant'Agata crest embossed on the lid in silver, and it looked exactly like what it was. A $200 component inside packaging that had cost 3 times that to design. Patricia called Gideon at 8:40. He said he'd be there by 10:30. He pulled into the service entrance at 10:22, which Celeste knew because she happened to be crossing the lower level on her way to a meeting. He had the same canvas jacket, or one like it. She couldn't be certain, and a thermos in his hand, and that same unhurried quality of movement that she had noticed the first time and that she suspected was not effect, but just how he was built. She was 4 minutes late to the meeting. Marcus. No, not Marcus, someone else. Her finance director asked if everything was okay. She said yes and meant it, which was specific enough to be worth noting. The repair took 4 hours and 17 minutes. She knew this because she checked the floor camera log that evening. Not for surveillance reasons. For the same low-level attentiveness she'd been paying to anything involving Gideon Hale since the morning he'd fixed her car in under 15 minutes and then told her, without unkindness, that she'd been standing alone in a dark bay because something was wrong that she hadn't named yet. He hadn't said it in those words. She wasn't entirely sure he'd meant it in those words. But that was what she'd heard, and she'd been turning it over in the days since, and she was self-aware enough to know that you didn't keep turning something over unless it had snagged on something real. When she came down to the floor at 3 o'clock, the Urus was running, not tentatively. Fully, the engine settled into its idle the way it was supposed to. Gideon was at the work table, writing notes in a small notebook with a worn cover. She noticed the notebook because it was unusual. Most people used their phones for everything now, and because she was starting to understand, very him. How'd it go? She said. He looked up. Clean installation. Continuity confirmed across both grounding points. I'd recommend a cold weather test drive before you take it below 40, just to verify the ground return under thermal contraction. He paused. Owen did good work. He did. He already knows, Gideon said. I told him. She looked at him. Most consultants don't bother, she said. Most consultants aren't trying to help anyone get better, he said, without weight, and went back to his notes. She sat down on the stool across the work table from him, which was not something she usually did. She didn't usually sit in service bays in the middle of the afternoon with a full inbox waiting upstairs. She sat down anyway. Can I ask you something, she said. He kept his pen. Sure. The shop in White Sulphur Springs. How long? 6 years in September. You went from Sant'Agata to a general repair shop in a town of 2,000 people. Yeah, that's a significant change. Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, but in the same direction. You could call it that. What would you call it? He was quiet for a moment, looking at his notebook rather than at her. Necessary, he said finally. The engineering work. You miss it. He considered that honestly, in the way people considered things when they were actually thinking about them rather than reaching for the answer that sounded right. Sometimes, he said, when I see a car like this one, and I know what's underneath it, there's a part of me that misses being inside that problem at that scale. The precision of it. Every system talking to every other system with no margin for error. He looked up briefly. But I don't miss the life around it, and you can't have one without the other. No, Celeste said. You can't. They were quiet for a moment. How old is she now? Celeste said. Your daughter. And his face did the thing she'd seen once before, the brief, unguarded thing, the expression that lived underneath all the containment. 7 3/4, he said. She'll correct me if I forget the 3/4. A small pause. Her name is Nora. She wants to be a geologist. Last month she wanted to be a marine veterinarian. Before that, a pilot. She changes her mind every few weeks. I think that's probably healthy. Celeste thought about herself at 7. She had wanted to be a truck driver, which was not something she mentioned often, because it had started as genuine fascination with her uncle's rig and had somewhere metabolized into something more complicated. The specific ambition of a child who understood on some inarticulate level that movement meant options, and options meant you were not stuck. I should let you get back, she said, standing. I'm done, he said. Just finishing the notes. She picked up her badge from the table where she'd set it down without thinking. "I'll have Patricia cut the check today," she said. "Appreciate it." She was almost to the door when she heard him say her name. Not Miss Ashford, just Celeste, which was the first time he'd used it, and it stopped her in a way that surprised her. She turned. He was looking at her with that same direct, attentive expression. "Not performing anything. The car drives better than you're expecting," he said. "You should take it out." She looked at him. "It's 43 degrees outside." 43 is fine, he said. "I said 40. She turned back toward the door, but she was smiling, and she was fairly certain he could see it. She took the Urus out that evening, south on I-90, until the city thinned and the mountains went dark and massive in every direction, and she pushed the car up, past 100 on a clear stretch before easing off. The engine sounded like something that had been waiting, and she thought about a man from White Sulphur Springs sitting in her service bay writing notes by hand in a worn notebook, and saying, "She'll correct me if I forget the 3/4 with the kind of simple, uncalculated love that people usually kept more hidden than that." She drove home with the heat on and felt, for the first time in a while, like something had been set right that she hadn't known was wrong. The check cleared the next morning. He didn't send a thank you email, which she noted because most people sent thank you emails after a check that size, and the ones who didn't were either thoughtless or self-sufficient. And he was clearly the latter. 4 days later, she called the shop in White Sulphur Springs. She had a reason ready, a question about cold weather battery management, something specific about monitoring the Performante system through the coming winter. It was a real question, not entirely invented, but she was also aware, in the honest back portion of her mind, where she kept accurate accounting of her own motivations, that the question could have been emailed, and she was calling instead. He answered on the second ring. "Hail Otto. It's Celeste Ashford. Do you have a few minutes?" A brief pause, not surprised but adjusting slightly. "Yeah, everything okay with the car?" "The car is fine. I took it out Wednesday evening. No issues." She paused. "I had a question about winter storage. We're supposed to get a sustained cold stretch next week, lows around 15. I want to make sure I'm managing the Performante system correctly through that." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the clear impression he was deciding whether the question was the actual question. "Keep the garage above 50 if you can," he said. "If it's going to be below 20 for more than 48 hours, start the car in the garage once a day and let it idle for 15 minutes. It cycles the battery management system under load and keeps the grounding contacts from sitting cold and static." Okay. She wrote it down, which she didn't need to do. "That's probably more caution than you need," he said. "But it doesn't hurt. Thank you." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "How's the shop?" she said. A brief sound that might have been a quiet laugh. "Busy. I've got a Tahoe in right now that the owner diagnosed himself using a forum post from 2014. He's very confident. The car is less confident. It'll drive again. Probably not by Friday. That's either a very complicated Tahoe or a very trusting forum." "Both," he said. "Definitely both." She smiled at her desk. "Thank you for the winter advice," she said. "Anytime," he said. And she caught something in the word, a slight weight to it, a small additional meaning. And then the call was over, and she was sitting at her desk looking at her notepad, which said above 50 idle 15 min in cold snap. And there was a small, unconscious line under the word anytime that she had drawn without thinking. She closed the notepad. She opened her email. She had 38 unread messages and a vendor call in 90 minutes. She was 34 years old and ran a company with 400 employees and owned a Lamborghini Urus that ran clean and cold in a Montana winter. And she had just drawn a line under a word in a notepad like she was 17 years old. She answered the emails. It took her longer than it should have. The cold arrived the following week, exactly as forecasted, dropping overnight temperatures to 12 degrees and keeping the daytime high below 25 for 5 straight days. Bozeman went still and gray and inward, the mountains invisible behind low cloud, the kind of cold that made the city quiet in a specific way. Celeste followed the instructions. She started the Urus each morning and let it idle for 15 minutes, sitting in the driver's seat in her coat for no practical reason she could articulate, listening to the engine turn over without hesitation, watching the exhaust make small clouds in the cold garage air. She was doing exactly this on the third morning when her phone rang. a number she didn't recognize, a 406 area code, which was Montana statewide. Celeste Ashford. It's Gideon. A pause. Gideon Hale. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you'd have this number. She hadn't. She'd called the shop line. I've got it now, she said. I'm calling because I wanted to ask you something, and asking at the shop felt. He paused, in the specific way he paused when he was choosing words rather than reaching for them. It didn't feel right to do it as a business call. She said nothing, which he understood correctly as an invitation to continue. There's a place in White Sulphur Springs, he said. Diner, really. Nothing fancy. They do a breakfast that Nora claims is the best in Montana, and she has been eating breakfast for 7 3/4 years, so she considers her evidence base solid. A brief pause. I take her on Saturday mornings, and I thought, if it's not a strange thing to ask, maybe you'd want to come this Saturday. The garage was quiet around the idling engine. Is Nora going to interrogate me? Celeste said. He was quiet for exactly 1 second, and then he laughed. A real laugh, more open than anything she'd heard from him before. Almost certainly, he said. She asks a lot of questions. I can warn her, but it won't fully work. Don't warn her, Celeste said. I like people who ask questions. A brief silence. Saturday, he said, 8:30. The place is called the Copper Elk. It's on Central Avenue. You'll see the sign. I'll find it. Another pause. Sorry for calling early. I was already up, she said. Which was true. Drive safe, he said. She hung up and sat for another moment in the idling Urus in the cold garage and felt the specific, slightly disorienting feeling of something that had been moving slowly and quietly arriving somewhere you hadn't quite prepared for. She had not had breakfast with anyone who was not a business contact in approximately 2 years. She had not voluntarily spent time with a child since her cousin's kid's birthday party the previous summer, which she had departed after 40 minutes by citing a call that had been, in honest retrospect, not strictly necessary. Saturday was 4 days away. She found herself looking at the 4 days as an obstacle, which was new information about herself and not entirely comfortable. The Copper Elk was exactly what the name suggested, a low, warm-windowed building on Central Avenue, with an actual copper elk weather vane on the roof that had turned green at the base from years of Montana weather. The parking lot had 8 cars in it when Celeste arrived at 8:27, including the gray F-250 she recognized before she recognized anything else. She sat in her car for 20 seconds. She was not a person who sat in her car. She made decisions and executed them. She had been doing this since she was 22 years old in an entry-level logistics coordinator role, making decisions faster than anyone else in the room and being right often enough that the room eventually stopped arguing. She got out of the car. The diner smelled like coffee and bacon fat and something sweet, and it had the specific warmth of a place that had been feeding the same people for 30 years and knew exactly what it was for. Gideon was in a corner booth, and across from him was a small girl with dark hair in 2 slightly uneven braids, and a purple fleece with a mountain goat embroidered on the pocket, who was drawing something on the back of a paper placemat with a ballpoint pen, and talking at the same time with the easy multitasking of someone who had been doing both since she learned to do either. The girl looked up when Celeste came through the door. She had her father's eyes, that same direct, observant brown, though on her face it wasn't containment so much as open, unfiltered appraisal. "Are you Celeste?" she said, before Celeste had taken 3 steps. "I am," Celeste said. "Dad said you have a Lamborghini." "Nora," Gideon said. "That's all right," Celeste said, sliding into the booth. "I do have a Lamborghini." Nora considered this with the seriousness of someone reviewing data. "Is it the fastest one?" "One of them." "How fast does it go?" "About 190 miles per hour." "Possibly more." Nora's eyes went wide. Then she looked at her father. "That's faster than the plane to Grandma's commercial aircraft cruise at about 560 miles per hour at altitude," Gideon said. "She wins on land." "Oh." Nora appeared to accept the geometry of this and returned to her drawing. "Dad says you fix cars. I run a company that sells and services high-end vehicles," Celeste said. "Your dad fixed my car, actually." Nora looked up. "He fixes everything," she said, with the complete conviction of someone who had never had reason to doubt it. "Last month he fixed the furnace and the dishwasher in the same afternoon." "The dishwasher was a loose hose clamp," Gideon said. "It was not impressive." "It was impressive to me," Nora said firmly, and went back to her drawing. Celeste looked across the table at Gideon, who had the expression of a man who had hoped this might go approximately this way and was quietly discovering that it was, and didn't entirely know what to do with that information. "Coffee," he said. "Please," she said. He poured from the carafe on the table, and she noticed his hands again. The roughness, the calm steadiness, the small scar on the back of his left hand that had the look of a tool injury from years back, healed clean but permanent. "What are you drawing, Celeste?" asked Nora. "A topographic map," Nora said without looking up. "Of the valley. I'm doing it from memory. I've been there a lot." She held it up briefly. It was, Celeste noted, surprisingly accurate for something drawn freehand in a diner booth by a 7-year-old. "That's remarkable," Celeste said. And she wasn't performing interest. The specificity of it, the quiet certainty of a child who had looked at the land enough times to carry it in her head, was genuinely remarkable. "I like knowing where things are," Nora said simply, as if this were the obvious reason for everything, and went back to drawing. Celeste felt something ease in her chest, quiet and unannounced. She didn't examine it immediately. She had learned over the years that some things were better understood after the fact than in the moment. She picked up the menu. "What's good here besides the obvious?" she asked Gideon. "The eggs are better than they have any right to be," he said. "And the rye toast. Don't skip the rye toast." "You don't look like a rye toast person," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "What does a rye toast person look like?" "I have no idea," she said honestly. "I just said it." Something shifted in his expression. The almost smile, the minimal concession to amusement that she was starting to understand was his version of a full grin. "Get the rye toast," he said. "You'll see." She got the rye toast. He was right. They sat in the warm booth while the morning continued outside, and Nora finished the topographic map and started a drawing of a mountain goat from memory with the same focused precision. And the coffee was genuinely good, and the conversation moved the way conversations moved when nobody was performing anything, a little uneven, occasionally interrupted by Nora with a question that cut across whatever they were discussing, threading through topics and dropping them and picking them back up. Gideon talked about the shop, not the polished version, but the actual texture of it, a vintage Dodge Power Wagon that a retired rancher had been bringing in for partial restorations for 4 years, never quite finishing, as if the unfinished restoration was the thing he actually wanted. A high school kid named, she'd forget the name later, it didn't matter, who had started coming in on Saturdays asking to learn basic maintenance, and whom Gideon had started letting stay. "Does he pay you?" Celeste asked. "No, you're teaching him for free." "Somebody taught me for free," Gideon said. "My father had a shop. I used to go there after school and hand him tools. He talked while he worked, and I learned more in that shop than in any classroom." He paused. "That kid is going to be good at this if someone gives him time." "I have time." She looked at him across the table and thought about credentials and expertise, and the architecture of what made someone valuable, and about a man who drove to the wrong address by accident and fixed a problem that 4 specialists had not fixed, because someone had given him time a long time ago in a shop somewhere. "That's a good thing to do," she said. He shrugged, the specific shrug of a person who did things because they were right and found being acknowledged for it slightly uncomfortable. "It's not a big deal." "It is, actually." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was slightly different from the usual contained one, something less settled. Nora looked up from the mountain goat. "Are you coming back next Saturday?" she said, with the directness of someone who had not yet learned to hide the actual question inside a different question. "Nora," Gideon said, at the same time Celeste said, "I'd like to." A small silence. Nora looked between them with the particular expression of a child who has understood something about the room that hasn't been said aloud yet, found it acceptable, and returned to her drawing. Gideon was looking at Celeste. She was looking at him. Outside, the cold had eased slightly, the way it did in late October when winter was present, but not yet fully committed, the air carrying the first thin suggestion of something else underneath. Celeste Ashford did not have ordinary Saturday mornings, had not had them in years. Saturdays were for the work that hadn't fit in the week, for the accumulated overflow of a life built on momentum and forward motion, and the deeply ingrained belief that stopping meant falling behind. She looked at her half-empty coffee cup. At the topographic map Nora was adding a river to, with careful attention to where the current would actually run. At Gideon across the table with his hands around his own cup, and that slightly unsettled expression she was, against all evidence of her own habits, finding herself wanting to see more of. Next Saturday, she said. He nodded once. 8:30, she said. 8:30, he agreed. Nora didn't look up from the map, but she smiled, and the mountains outside were where they always were, massive and indifferent and permanent, the way things were that didn't need to announce themselves, the way the most important things tended to be, not loud, not credentialed, not expensive, just present, quietly carrying the load, waiting for someone patient enough to find them.